The only thing to fear is fear itself. And Bane's wrist joint.
Winding down the Dark Knight trilogy Batman wave from McFarlane Toys, we got Scarecrow, which, from that New York leak, thought to myself, okay, this is the one that could easily have been swapped for another character, and I know I kind of touched upon that a little bit during the Two-Face review, but like I kind of suspected and thought to myself, is this really going to happen? Is Scarecrow going to be able to pull off an underdog move and become a bit of an underrated gem amongst that series? At least for me, that actually has quite a bit of potential, because as you can see right here, they went with an aesthetic choice that could have been influenced by McFarlane, like I mentioned before, that I just wasn't really perceiving when it came to Dark Knight Trilogy Scarecrow. McFarlane decided to incorporate the two different kind of identities he has going forward in that movie. One that's a bit more business casual, or rather more business, with the suit underneath, and then the giant straight jacket here on top. And that's one of the things that you have to suspend with disbelief as far as the stylization of this figure. Straight jackets by default are not going to be this long. They're definitely going to have the long sleeves, obviously, because they're required to be able to tie around. But the actual length draping over here towards the bottom of the suit is a little exaggerated for stylistic effect, as McFarlane tends to do with their figures and their adaptations. Nevertheless, the actual amount of detail and scorching and paint applications and the actual texturing going alongside the kind of burlappy look of the straitjacket really works, especially in real life. Honestly, this is one of the better looking McFarlanes that I've encountered in some time, only because of how well they were able to execute on the paint apps and the actual texture detail for the straitjacket. You could see a little bit of the straps kind of coming undone here towards the front, as well as on the left sleeve. You have the tethering, the weathering, the actual rippage of the middle part right here. And this should not come as too big of a surprise, considering that McFarlane has had a history of kind of perfecting this texture look for the 7-inch figures, especially trailing back to some of their horror icon stuff, like whenever they were doing Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Obviously, he's going to be wearing the skin-like texture on his mask. So McFarlane has kind of refined that look, and they applied all those techniques here to Scarecrow to make him really stand out as far as detail. I would even argue that this is probably amongst the 4 that I can see customizers looking at and going, either they want to amplify because they want to get creative with the texture that's already kind of been met halfway with them, or just leave it alone because you really have a great looker of a piece here. I just think that you have to, again, disassociate yourself a little bit with the suspension of disbelief of how large this is, and also how inaccurate it is, considering that he never really had this style of attire, whether it be throughout Batman Begins or even in the opening sequences of The Dark Knight. He either had the suit from underneath with the sack head, or he had the straitjacket, and underneath he just had like regular clothes. Now, you could make the argument that we didn't really see his full outfit in Batman Begins because everybody was affected by the toxin. They were looking at him differently. From where I stood, it looked like he just had regular Asylum clothes underneath. He never, when you check into Arkham Asylum, how many of you are actually going to be able to keep your 3-piece suit underneath? So they had to, change some things up and mishmash here. But frankly, it actually kind of works here in figure form. And again, that texturing and the detail still comes through well with the suit underneath. It becomes a little more standard, so much so that even for a fleeting second, I thought to myself that they had reutilized the suit mold of Two-Face onto here to cut a slight corner. But thankfully, upon closer inspection, I noticed that it's actually not the same suit. There's actually a different kind of tailoring to the bottom cuffs here of his pants that look a little different than that of Two-Face, and actually cements that this is an entirely different mold underneath, along with a slightly more elongated suit jacket underneath. It's only this little piece right here, kind of dematerializes, so to speak, as you go forward if you take a look underneath. But it's cool to see that they even went with a brand new mold for the suit underneath to give him his own little personal touches to make this figure come alive even better. And even more of those tiny little details as you navigate up the jacket, again, are some of my favorite facets of this figure. Even the strap holding his sack down on his face. Now, that's probably the only little point of contention that I think a lot of people are going to debate is going to be the head sculpt. And for the most part, the texturing and the actual feel and look of the burlap sack looks amazing. It really does. And I like that they went ahead and painted in the eyes and gave him a little bit more of skin texture underneath those eye holes. The only thing that I'm a little on the fence about is adding the little maggots on the right part of his face right there. You can kind of see the stitching to form a little bit of that upside down frown face, or the teeth kind of coming through a little bit better. But I don't know how I feel about the maggots for two reasons. One, it just doesn't look right all that great amongst the sculpt. It just kind of looks like my figure's got a little bit of dust or particles on there that I want to scrape off, only to realize or to remember that this is just part of the sculpting going on right there. But also, being OCD as I am, I also call back to the movie, and it's a slight inaccuracy portraying those maggots, and that is that the only times that you see the maggots coming out of his face is when he poisons Rachel, not Batman, with the toxin, and even then he was wearing his suit. I could have used the maggots off because like I said, it's something that's just affected by the toxin, it's subjective, so I think that it would have probably benefited the face for me personally to not have the maggots there. That way we could see a little bit more of the stitching on the face and the eyes, and it calls more attention to those details as opposed to the maggots. They just kind of stand out to me as a little abrasive to hammer home across that this is the Scarecrow. Aside from that though, this is actually a much better looking piece than I was anticipating when pulling him out, and I really have to give an awful lot of credit to that because I'm actually liking him more and more, even more than some prior figures amongst this wave. Making me even more surprised is knowing just how well articulated he is, even with this jacket on, because one of my greatest fears when they were kind of announcing and promoting the figure up against its really preeminent release was that the jacket was going to be limiting an awful lot of the articulation because of the way that it just looks like it's all wrapped all over the figure, and it's going to be potentially intruding with those joints. I was actually very surprised to see how much they incorporated that into the jacket itself. Head is able to rotate 360 degrees very fluidly, as well as being able to move upwards and downwards, and much more flexible than, like I said, I was giving it credit for, and tilting side to side, especially with the sack right there, thinking to myself it was going to cause a form of a problem, but lo and behold, that doesn't seem to be the case. Then we get to the arms, which were one of my biggest worries. But then I saw that there was an awful lot of cutting going alongside here without ever really messing up the sculpting of the overall sleeve, and at the same time blending in the joints into the, I guess you could say, not to sound pretentious here, but the architecture of the jacket itself works beautifully because you're able to rotate the arm 360 degrees via the cut right here from the sleeve, as well as very extensively extend the arms to the sides and giving him a very static T-pose like you see before you're there. Mine did have a bit of a loose joint on the left, but still it's able to hold its own. And then when we get to the elbows, that's where we get to our first little drawback, but it's nothing too major, and that is that we only get one joint at the elbow that's able to bend almost at a 90 degree, and then the bicep swivel is technically gone because it's not really in the middle of the bicep, but they baked it into the top part of the elbow, much like mega figures tend to do. So he's able to swivel at the top part of the elbow as opposed to the bicep, and then you have the hinge joint, like I mentioned before, bending at a 90 degree angle right there. So it's one of those joints that I appreciate, especially when it comes to a very husky sleeve piece like here with the straight jacket, but at the same time, there's a tiny little part of me that wishes they would have gone with just the standard two joints at the elbow and then one at the bicep. But at the same time, it's not a make or break. What could be a make or break, I have yet to decide amongst myself, but that is going to be the wrist joints. The joints themselves are there. They're able to allow the hand to rotate 360 degrees as well as pivot inwards and outwards, but as you can tell, I am having a little bit of difficulty doing so, and that is because my first and potentially only major complaint about the figure, not even a nitpick but a legitimate complaint, is that these sleeves are sculpted very durably, which you would argue would be a positive, but in this case, because of the way that the straight jacket is designed by nature, it is going to be limiting your access, at least my access, and that's considering that I don't really have too big of fingers. But getting to actually move the wrist joints and the hands overall, especially when we get to accessories, is going to be a major issue. So the fist is going to be the most terrible use of this example for the articulation on the wrist. It's actually going to be the open hand where you have a little bit better access since the fingers are extended, and even that one's a little problematic, so just do be careful with that as you kind of try to get your fingers in there, especially if your fingers tend to be just a little bit on the sausagey side. Now, similar to that of the Joker, because of the way that not only does he have the suit underneath here, but also the straitjacket, they gave him that similar torso as that of Joker and even Two-Face, where he's not necessarily all that hollowed out. I do feel like his overall torso piece is a little girthier and bigger than that of Joker's, but you can still feel like there's some empty spaces here on the oblique area. Nevertheless, though, that is made in order to allow the extension and the crunching of the torso to come as best as it possibly could, considering this overall design work, because you are able to crunch them slightly inwards like so. You only get a really hefty amount of resistance due to the straitjacket as well as the suit underneath, and some slight extension. Actually, you can kind of feel a little bit of the hollowness on the back, and when you do that, you can then press forward and get them to extend towards the back a little bit more generously. From sides to sides, not so much, but you can see right there that at the waist area, he is able to move both of his legs in conjunction like so, and thus also at the waist, allowing full rotation 360 degrees of either the top half or the bottom half. So there is some movement there, but you just have to kind of take the entire context of the suit jacket and the suit underneath into full consideration. Likewise, the top leg joints can only extend only about that far, and they do start to kind of revert back to normal only because of how much of the rubber here on the suit and the suit jacket are kind of pressing them back into place. And then of course extending towards the back can only go so far because of the way everything is designed. So extension is also going to be a similar beast, except of course, if you're able to futz and kind of push the suit jacket behind the legs, you're able to get a good amount of extension going right there. The two joints at the knees are also able to fully bend. Of course, they're going to be a little limited due to the way that the suit jacket kind of impedes it, but they are there. As well as the ankles, and similar to that of Joker's and Two-Face's, because he is, of course, wearing a suit, those ankles are not going to be the best. They do allow rotation 360 degrees, but only slight pivoting upwards and downwards, like you see before you're there. And the toesies, much like Two-Face's, are much more flexible than I was anticipating, so it's cool to see that they are still there. Unfortunately, because of the way that the straitjacket is designed, and again, over-stylized and over-encompassing the entirety of the figure, along with the way that the suit cuffs, or at least the cuffs on his ankles, are designed because of the way that he is wearing a suit, he is going to be a little top heavy. And right when I say that, he's actually not falling over. But I was just going to use this as a way to exemplify exactly why I was using the black base this entire time. Now it doesn't seem to be all that much of the case as long as you're able to disperse the weight, but just know that that could be a potential issue. To me, the bigger issue would again be those hands, because that's when we bring in the only real accessories he came with, which are these alternate holding hands. I'm going to call them holding hands because they're both identical and they both look like they're designed to hold something. Now, again, this is where you can maybe bring the argument that he was meant to come with a firearm, but because of the issues, he wasn't going to, and that's where the munitions pack come into play, except when it comes to actual screen accuracy, thinking back, Scarecrow never used a gun. The only thing I can really think of is his toxin that he was able to disperse through like a glove, through this like device that he has on his wrist, or maybe he will have some kind of vial that would have the toxin chemicals inside. I don't know. And to me, I probably would have taken that instead of the alternate hands because again, these hands are designed to almost be like trigger hands, so yeah, it doesn't really line up with the way that we witnessed him on screen. And then on top of that, calling back to what I mentioned during the articulation, these sleeves, as well as the cuffs around those straitjacket sleeves, are a little too big for me to have very, I guess you could say, convenient access to the wrists. I've actually already tried twice to swap the hands, and though the fisted hand is a bit on the easier side to get out there and get a good firm grip on to pull it, tug it, and finally swap out the hand for the other, the actual alternate hand here was designed in a way where it just doesn't flush all the way through, and it just doesn't feel like it's making full contact with the joint and stay inside. Now, thankfully, because of the way of the girthiness of the cuff is able to retain an awful lot of pressure on the joint, the hand stays, except every time I try to move the hand, it comes off. And don't even get me started on this hand. Try as I might, I'm probably going to need like needle nose pliers, something to actually get in there and pull the hand out. Or again, put it in boiling water so that it falls off a little bit quicker, or pass the hair dryer over it and make the plastic just a little softer on the left hand to be able to tug it a little easier and get the hands to swap. But even then, like I said, contextually, it just doesn't make any sense to give them these hands except for maybe putting some form of firearm. That's why I thought to myself, okay, instead of these alternate hands, I would have utilized like a vial or just something else, maybe an alternate head to swap for this one if they had gotten the rights to Cillian Murphy's likeness. And then the alternate accessory would have been the sack, like the loose sack. We see Spider-Man figures do this an awful lot, where they have the alternate Peter Parker head and then they throw in a crumpled up mask so he can hold it in hand. That would have been sick. Oh my god, this would have been honestly one of the most underrated gems and one of my favorites amongst the wave if that were to happen. But frankly, that just ends up being a missed opportunity. Nevertheless, I am genuinely surprised with just how much I ended up liking this figure, much more than I was expecting. And even more so than even Two-Face and possibly even Batman. And it's because of the appreciated work on the texturing and the details for that straitjacket, the sculpting on his burlap sack head, the little details to actually make the suit underneath come through, and just overall the build quality and the articulation that does not go unnoticed made me respect this figure even more. And because of that, I'm going to be giving the Dark Knight Trilogy Scarecrow a 7 out of 10. I definitely think that nobody should sleep on this, considering that we all generally gravitate towards Batman and of course the Joker and potentially Two-Face when we think of this new McFarlane wave, but definitely do not sleep on Scarecrow. Otherwise, those dreams will become nightmares. And if you want to follow my advice and bring forth the Master of Fear into your collection, then be sure to utilize the links in the description below. And then, of course, if you have not checked out any of the Dark Knight Trilogy McFarlane Toys figures that I've covered thus far, then check out the one showing up on screen right now. As always, stay humble, and I'll catch you guys later.